Thank you very much. Yeah, I hope you can see the words I've got on the screen there. Very wise set of comments spoken about 300 years ago. The best way to suppose what may come is to remember what is past. The best qualification of a prophet is to have a good memory. Experience makes more prophets than revelation. It's an obvious enough lesson. If you want to see the future, look at what happened in analogous ways in the past, and that gives you a pretty good idea. We've lived through episodes of dramatic climate change in the past, and they were in many important ways very different from what we've got coming in the future. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about the climate and catastrophe idea, and then move to the notion of so what does this mean for faith, for religion? How can we learn? Well, you've all seen graphs like this, and I don't want to beat them to death, but the point is this. Episodes of climate disaster in the past had particular causes, and the good thing was that they went away of their own accord. We're now moving into an era where things do not go away of their own accord. And long story short, certain fossil product emissions are pumping more and more substances into the atmosphere. And there's a really radical change with industry, and especially in very recent years. And that is having an effect on climate. As you see in this figure, you'll see the huge thing that's happened in the last 50 years is when China starts to industrialize big time 20 years ago. And China is now, a very large and central part of the basic issue. But if you look at these maps, the line, the purple line says atmospheric carbon dioxide parts per million. And through most of the last, basically many thousand years, that figure was around 280 parts a million. And look what happens with the Industrial Revolution, look what happens after about 1900, and then especially from the 1970s onwards. We're presently at about 420 parts a million, which is a figure we haven't hit in many, many millions of years, not thousands, millions. How high can it go? And if it goes to 450 or it goes to 500, we're into an area that we have not seen in tens of millions of years, when it is highly likely that global temperatures will go up by at least a couple of degrees Celsius. And that'll have big impacts in parts of the world. Some countries are in a relatively good position to survive this. I mean, if you're in Canada or if you're in Siberia, you're in for a golden age when agriculture is going to be much, much better and more fertile, and this is wonderful. If you're in other parts of the world, oh, this is very bad news. If I was a policymaker or a politician dealing with a crisis in 10 or 20 years, and they said, oh, this is happening in the country of X, my first question would be, okay, what is its latitude? Where is it? Is it between the tropics? Is it between 23 degrees north, 23 degrees south of the equator? Because those areas are going to be heating very dramatically. They're going to be suffering very dramatic, very quick change. And in the vast majority of cases, they do not have the resources to deal with it. Well, heating in its own right is one thing, but it has implications. It means that people cannot grow food as they did. It means that they don't have water as they did. They'll suffer a lot of natural disasters which become unsustainable. If you look at countries of West Africa that most of us would have a real problem putting them on the map these days, like Burkina Faso and Niger and Mali, by some projections, they could be going up in temperature by about 5, 6, or 7 degrees Celsius during the century. That is the point where human life becomes unsustainable. There are more and more people in those areas. What do? Well, one is they fight over the resources that are left. The other is they migrate. So, what happens in those countries does not stay in those countries. And I just urge your attention, as I say, to those areas of the tropics. And the closer you get to the equator, the more issues you have. And there's a line that people often draw, which is it's called the 10th parallel, 10 degrees north of the equator, which is going to be suffering incredible heating, but also for the last 30 years has been the main battlefront around the world of Christianity and Islam. Shall we just say that is not going to get better as the environment declines? So you look at these tropical areas facing, very rapid heating, very rapid change. If you're in Australia, you're in a very wealthy country, you can afford to live this out. Other countries can't. One of the world's largest countries by population is Indonesia. It's by far the world's largest Muslim country. Last year, its capital city, Jakarta, had incredible floods. Here's a picture thereof. How bad are things in Jakarta? The government of Indonesia has decided to move the capital. They say it'll be underwater by 2050. They are moving. They are going somewhere else. And that's an extreme solution. But what does that mean if you live there? Who do you blame? And a lot of history suggests that other religions will be blamed. If you believe, as many of us do in our hearts, that these things are, quote, acts of God, then we have to find out who God is angry with. The most populous country in Africa is Nigeria. Nigeria's capital is Lagos. And I just ask you to look at that name, Lagos, because it's from an old Portuguese word, which is the same as for lakes. And what it's telling us is it's built on coastal land, which was reclaimed from the water, lots of little islands. And with climate change, Lagos, which probably has 25 million people, is going to revert to the waters. And this is what happened a couple of years ago with flooding in Lagos. The lakes are reclaiming Lagos, and that's not unusual. In some areas near the coasts, you get rising water. In other areas inland, you get a completely different issue, which is the spread of deserts. You get this word desertification, which if it's not in our vocabulary now is going to be a lot over the next 20, 30 years. I just ask you to look at this map and you look at the red areas. The gray areas are places that are already desert and dry, okay? The red areas are ones which are in extreme danger of desert. Look at two areas in particular. Look at Africa. See that red line along the 10th parallel, which is also the borderline between Christians and Muslims. Look at the amount of red, by the way, in the United States. But also look at the red across the world's main areas of conflict in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in much of Iran. And think of the impact of people losing the rather poor livelihoods they have presently to desert, and think what that will do to conflict. Apart from being a great splash on the screen, I sort of like this slide. This is a map of the El Nino phenomenon. And it shows the heating of the waters on the eastern side of the Pacific. And a major El Nino has climatic effects worldwide. It can affect the Nile, for example. There's a great study that I use. One of the most extreme El Ninos of modern times came in 1982 to 83. And what that study did was it correlated that El Nino and its impact around the world on wars and rebellions and massacres. And you look at all these things happening suddenly in 82, 83, 84, and we think of them as being separate and individual, but when you realize they all have this climate context, suddenly it all makes sense. Civil war and massacre in Sudan, famine in Ethiopia, guerrilla wars, risings, revolutions in Central America. Some countries were hit hard by this, like Australia, but they were rich enough. They can dig out to something like that. If you're in Sudan, if you're in Nicaragua, if you're in Peru, you can't. When people are starving, when people are hungry, when people's livelihoods fall apart, they do a couple of things. They rebel, they fight their neighbors, and often they look for religious solutions. And that's what I'll come back to. In many countries, for instance, like Peru, this is the point at which people in their millions flood into great cities like Lima. Lima becomes a megalopolis, suddenly acquires like 10 million people. And the outcome of that is the enormous growth of Pentecostal churches, because that's where people get their material and spiritual needs met. A climate catastrophe in the 1980s leads to the growth of a great religious change and religious movement. And what I'm suggesting is that something like that is a large part of the futures that we're looking at in coming decades. So I look at that 1982 3 thing, and the suggestion is that is, in a sense, the new normal of the 2020s and 2030s. This is an interesting map, by the way. This is a map of that 10th parallel idea, and it maps the 10th parallel roughly, and it shows the conflicts between Christians, Muslims, and Hindus along that. And you notice it's interesting, they don't extend the line into the Americas, because if they do, that would include all the areas of Central America that were in such bloody wars through the 1980s, Guatemala and Nicaragua, where there's so much of a religious element to those struggles. So my suggestion is, if we're dealing with an era of very rapid climate change, that would be very strenuous, stressful for many parts of the world, what are the implications? And first of all, you're talking about conflict, you're talking about turmoil, but you're also talking about them being understood, interpreted in religious ways, because that's what people do. That's what we tend to think. So what are some of the changes? Well, immigration. In the last 20 years, climate has been a major factor driving the millions of migrants from Africa and the Middle East who've crossed the Mediterranean. Tens of thousands have died on boats like this. That brings in a kind of religious change in its own right, because it brings in African, Middle Eastern forms of Christianity and Islam into Europe. And that's an obvious enough thing. If people are fleeing climate disasters in West Africa, Central Africa, where do they go? They go to rich countries. They go to North America, they go to Europe, they go to Australia. And so you get a new kind of religious globalization. The other thing you get is a great many wars over the resources that are still available. If you have an area in very delicate balance between different peoples, religions, and suddenly you get an enormous stress that water supplies shrink, food supplies shrink, the desert spread, people tend to fight more, and they also tend to attribute those disasters to religious causes. You know, one thing which is very current here, and I really wish I did not have to mention this, back in November, something horrible happened in the nation of Ethiopia. The northern part of Ethiopia is in the middle of a very complex series of wars. And just last November, in one of the most ancient Christian cities in the world, which is Aksum in Ethiopia, incredible holy place for tens of millions of people, they were holding a great pilgrimage, and rival forces, in this case Eritrean forces, descended on Aksum, and they killed probably 1,000 people in the streets, many of whom were killed in that church itself, which for a large part of African Christianity is as holy as St. Peter's in Rome or Westminster Abbey. If you are a member of that church, you believe that that is the actual seat of the original Ark of the Covenant. And if you want to see, if you like, religious disaster and conflict arising from climate-driven stress, we could do no better than to look at something like that Axum disaster. So I would urge you to say, think in terms of, if you like, religious change, in terms of religious movement, religious conflict, religious tension. You know, one area I look at, for example, well, I won't bother with that. I pay a lot of attention to a huge area of East Africa, which is the home of what we call the Great Lakes, the African Great Lakes. By 2050, they will be supporting about 1 billion people. And they are in a very hot area that's going to become a much hotter area. And already those lakes are suffering terrible economic and environmental damage. Some of the world's most delicate religious situations exist in the areas dependent on the Great Lakes. Things will not get better. What are some of the other changes? I think as people become more stressed and often desperate, they return to new forms of religious expression, and we are already seeing a great wave of religious revivalism around the world. Now, these pictures are American, but you just have to change things a little bit, and you have the revivals and miracle crusades that are such a common feature of life in Africa, in South Asia, in Christian areas of Indonesia, in South America, where people come together for this kind of passionate excitement and release, and to be convinced that God really is guiding things and God really is on your side. And the scale of these revivals is amazing. I mean, there are groups in Nigeria, in Lagos, for example, and they regularly hope to bring in 1 million, 1.5 million people to their revivals. You see these absolutely everywhere. This is the what's called the Deeper Life Bible Church. You may not have heard of the Deeper Life as a denomination. Very, very regularly, they will pull in 1 million people to their revivals. It's one of the most important churches in Africa. And as you see, what they're doing is they're offering miracles. Fractured bone healed, deaf child hears. We live in the great age of miracle crusades and revivals. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist that poster because I do like it. I can't keep calm. I'm Pentecostal. The kind of religion that exists in those revivals might be strictly Pentecostal, or it might be Catholic, charismatic, or it might be other kinds of religion that are borrowing from those Christian styles. There are Islamic groups in Africa that have faced such competition from Christians that they have adopted many Pentecostal worship styles, which is kind of an interesting thought. So you see people trying to get closer to God in these times of strain and crisis, to look for different sorts of solution. But there are other things that we learn from our history, meaning our in the West, which I think would also apply to the future. You see these revivals around. For instance, one thing I talked about is in centuries gone by, when there was a climate-driven catastrophe, people tended to look for the evil people who were driving this crisis. And that's a big feature driving the witch hunts in Europe and to some extent in North America. We're very familiar with that. Or surely that couldn't happen again. Well, yeah, we live today in the great age of witch hunts. We hear a lot about them in Africa. They're extremely common in India, in Indonesia. They happen in Christian societies. They happen in Islamic societies. They happen in Hindu societies. When things go bad, people look for the bad people who are causing it, and that means witches. There are whole industries of witch hunters and witch finders. And as things get worse in terms of climate, that is where a lot of the effort will go. And I'm not saying this is the distant future. This is now. In fact, one of the surprising things and disappointing things, people tended to think that witch hunts would go away when people moved into cities and became more urban and sophisticated and so on. Quite the contrary. If you look in South African cities like Soweto or Nigerian cities like Lagos, witch hunts are doing just fine, thank you very much. So I would worry very much about things like that. I would worry that stressed societies, whether you're dealing with West Africa or the Great Lakes or India, Indonesia, what would we see? Religious conflict, religious migration, a hunt for scapegoats, whether they are another religion or the witches who are around. By the way, if I can just explain this this poster, you will get witch hunters in contemporary Africa, and they will come along and they will say, okay, that person is guilty, that person is guilty. They have to be driven from the community. And sometimes those people will, persecuted people will form basically pressure groups and say, well, you know, no, we're not witches. We deserve to be let back into the community. At the moment, this is, if you like, from the Western point of view, it's an interesting thing. And people tend to say, oh, you know, how can people behave like that? Well, the reality is they are, and they will. But you do wonder, just put yourself in the position of somebody facing these extreme climate changes in one of the areas of the world where more and more larger proportion of the people are going to be living. How do they explain it? How open are you to new religious expressions? And I would remind you, back in 1819, when North America was in the middle of a terrible climate crisis, it opened the way to people setting up new religions, setting up new religious expressions, which might exist within the realm of Christianity or not, might move outside it. This, as I say, is the origins of the Mormon faith. I would not dare predict a whole new religion, but I'm just saying if things did become that extreme, this would be a great age for prophets, for people claiming a new revelation. And you think of the resources to which they turn. And, you know, if you actually think about this, when you read the sacred scriptures of the great religions, what kind of ammunition do they offer you for interpreting catastrophic change like this? And it's interesting. This is one area in which the Bible has a lot more to say than the Quran. The Quran talks about extreme climate. It talks about, you know, storms and so on. The Bible is amazing like this. Think about it. So much of the biblical story is about people being liberated or delivered by passage through the seas. It's about visions of deserts blossoming, deserts coming back to life. And I don't propose this as my future career choice, but if I was going to be a prophet or to set up a new religion in societies like this, I know the scriptures I would be using right now to try and convince people, yes, God foresaw this. This is something that was fulfilled in scriptures. This is from Isaiah 35. The wilderness and the solitary place shall be glad for them. The desert shall rejoice and blossom as the rose. It shall blossom abundantly and rejoice even with joy and singing. So we read that, something like that in church week by week. We might get that in the Psalms. But just imagine if you're reading that in a society where that land over there used to be green, now it's desert. Oh, wait, here's a promise that it could be brought back. And that's kind of an interesting idea in its own right. If you pick up the Bible, if you pick up the Christian Bible and look at the very end and the very last page or 2 pages, you find a verse that may or may not have registered with you. But I ask you, if you're in Lagos or Jakarta, what would you make of this? I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. Well, we tend to like the sea. We want to live by the sea, but we like the sea to remain within its proper limits and not to come and drown our cities. So what I'm saying is, if you imagine people around the world deeply involved in Christianity or Islam or Hinduism. Hinduism has its great apocalyptic images. The apocalyptic ideas are there waiting to be used and exploited. And I find it inconceivable that they will not be used and exploited if in fact crises develop as they appear to be. And after many kind of grim messages, I will end with what I believe to be an optimistic comment. And, you know, I'm not talking here about, you know, counsels of despair. There are many, many things that can be done. But Germaine Greer, who used to be very celebrated as a pioneering feminist and a woman who is, shall we say, very combative. She can start a fight in an empty room, but she has this wonderful line: perhaps catastrophe is the natural human environment. And even though we spend a good deal of energy trying to get away from it, we are programmed for survival amid catastrophe. That's what we're good at. And we're good at responding to challenges. We might have a couple of decades where we're struggling. So, in other words, I don't want to end on a note of we're all doomed, this is the apocalypse, it's the end of the world. We are dealing with troubling times, and these are troubling times that in the past have produced religious solutions, new religious movements, and new religions. And to go back to my friend, the Marquis of Halifax, who I quoted at the start, the best way to understand the future is to understand the past. And the best qualification to be a prophet is to have a good memory. And what I'm encouraging us all to do here is to have good memory.